I first noticed it on a cold night when the entire house felt unusually silent. My wife shifted beside me, her body trembling slightly, and before I could ask if she was okay, she quietly slid out of bed. Her footsteps moved across the floor with an unnatural softness, as though she were trying to erase her presence from the room entirely. I kept my eyes half closed, feigning sleep, but my chest tightened with an unease I couldn't name. It was past midnight, and she had never left our room at this hour before. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Stress, maybe. She had been juggling so much lately: our son, the house, her demanding work schedule. Everyone needs solitude sometimes. But when it happened again the next night, and then the night after that, my reassurances began to crumble. For an entire week, the pattern repeated itself with clockwork precision. She would lie motionless beside me, waiting until my breathing slowed and steadied, then slip away into the darkness. The door would close behind her with barely a whisper, as though even the hinges were conspiring to keep her secret. In the mornings, she looked different. There was a hollowness in her eyes that she couldn't explain. When I asked if she'd rested well, her smile would falter for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, painting on an expression that felt rehearsed. Other times, she seemed to be somewhere else entirely, her gaze distant and unfocused, lost in thoughts she refused to share. I tried to convince myself that married couples go through phases, that stress ebbs and flows like the tide. But beneath my rationalizations, fear took root and began to grow. One evening at dinner, I watched her push food around her plate, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. When I gently asked if something was wrong, her response came too quickly, her voice pitched just slightly too high. She forced brightness into her tone, but her eyes told a different story. That moment haunted me long after the dishes were cleared. The look on her face wasn't just exhaustion or worry. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share, a secret that was slowly crushing her from the inside. And though I desperately wanted to believe otherwise, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that something in our marriage had shifted, that the foundation I thought was solid had developed cracks I was only now beginning to see. The next morning, I noticed our son sitting at the breakfast table with a pallor that made him look almost ghost-like. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He barely touched his cereal, instead pushing the pieces around his bowl in listless circles. When I looked at him, he averted his gaze immediately, as though eye contact itself was too much to bear. This wasn't ordinary tiredness. This was something deeper, more troubling. I tried to draw him out with gentle questions about school, about his friends, about anything that might crack through his silence. His responses came in monosyllables, flat and colorless, completely unlike his usual animated chatter. When I asked directly if he was feeling sick, he shook his head, but still wouldn't meet my eyes. The distance between us felt vast, despite sitting only a few feet apart. I leaned forward, softening my voice to barely above a whisper. "Hey buddy, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Is something bothering you?" For just a moment, his defenses wavered. His fingers gripped the edge of his bowl until his knuckles whitened, and his lips parted as though words were fighting to escape. But then the moment passed. His jaw clenched, and he muttered an unconvincing, "I'm fine," that hung in the air between us like a lie we both recognized but neither acknowledged. Before I could press further, my wife intervened with a speed that felt almost aggressive. "He's just tired," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion as she placed a protective hand on his shoulder. The gesture seemed designed to shield him, though from what, I couldn't say, perhaps from me. My son leaned into her touch, and she drew him closer, creating a united front that left me on the outside looking in. Breakfast continued in strained silence. I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on all of us, creating an atmosphere so thick it was hard to breathe. My son kept his eyes downcast, while my wife's gaze flickered toward me with something I could only describe as wariness. By the time we finished eating, the feeling had settled deep in my bones. Something fundamental had shifted in our home. An invisible barrier was rising between us, and I had no idea how to tear it down. That night, I made a decision. I would follow her. The thought filled me with shame even as I committed to it, but I needed to understand what was happening to my family. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, controlling my breathing to mimic sleep, every muscle tense with anticipation. When I felt the mattress shift and heard her feet touch the floor, I remained perfectly still. Only after the door closed behind her did I dare to move. I slipped from the bed and into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house felt different at night, shadows stretching and distorting familiar shapes into something almost menacing. I kept close to the walls, using the darkness as cover. Following the faint sound of her footsteps down the hall, she stopped outside our son's room, her hand resting on the doorknob for what felt like an eternity. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to brace herself before slowly pushing the door open. I positioned myself where I could see without being seen, my hands pressed against the wall to steady myself. Inside, her voice drifted out, low and urgent, carrying a tone I'd never heard from her before. It held notes of desperation, of sorrow, of something I couldn't quite identify. I strained to make out the words, but they remained just beyond comprehension. A frustrating murmur that told me nothing and everything at once. Our son was awake and sitting up in bed. Even in the dim light, I could see the fear etched across his small face. His shoulders were rigid, his eyes wide and unblinking as he watched her approach. She sat beside him and reached out to brush his hair back from his forehead, her hand trembling as she whispered faster now, the words tumbling over themselves. He looked on the verge of tears, his lower lip quivering as he struggled to maintain composure. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't a mother comforting a child after a nightmare. This was something else entirely, something that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. When she leaned closer and her shadow engulfed him, I saw him flinch, just barely, but enough. I retreated before they could discover me, moving as quietly as I'd come, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling as my thoughts spiraled. The pieces didn't fit together into any picture I recognized. All I knew with certainty was that the worry that had been gnawing at me for days had transformed into something much darker. Something I could no longer pretend didn't exist. By morning, the knot in my chest had grown so tight, I could barely breathe around it. Every moment from the previous night replayed in an endless loop. My wife's whispers echoing in my mind, my son's frightened expression burned into my memory. I kept telling myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation, that the people I loved wouldn't deliberately hurt me. But doubt had taken root, and with each passing hour, it grew stronger, more insistent, drowning out the voice of reason. I found myself standing in an electronics store that afternoon, staring at a display of security cameras. My hands felt clammy, my stomach churning with guilt and determination in equal measure. The camera one finally selected was small enough to hide easily, designed to be unobtrusive. As I held the box, I felt like I was holding evidence of my own failure. Proof that trust in my marriage had eroded to the point where I needed electronic surveillance to feel secure. I justified it to myself in a dozen different ways. This was about protecting my family. This was about understanding what was happening under my own roof. This was about my son's well-being, about my wife's strange behavior, about all the questions that had piled up with no answers in sight. But underneath all the rationalizations, I knew the truth. I was afraid, and this camera represented my inability to simply ask for the truth directly, to trust that honesty would prevail. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, I entered my son's room with the camera concealed in my palm. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped it twice as I positioned it behind a stack of books on his shelf, angling it carefully to capture the entire room. With each adjustment, I felt more like a stranger in my own home, like someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When I finally stepped back to examine my work, the camera was virtually invisible, and I felt simultaneously relieved and disgusted with myself. As I left the room, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. Whatever that camera revealed, there would be no going back. The truth, whatever it was, would change everything. The following night found me alone in the living room. The house settled into the deep silence that comes only after midnight. I sat with my laptop open, the camera's memory card inserted, cursor hovering over the file. My hands felt numb, my breath shallow. I told myself I was ready for anything, but my racing heart suggested otherwise. When I finally clicked play and the footage began, every muscle in my body locked in place. The video showed our son lying awake in bed, his eyes fixed on the door with an expression of resigned anticipation. He knew she was coming. Minutes ticked by before the door eased open and my wife entered, moving like someone afraid of being caught. She looked exhausted beyond measure, her movements slow and careful as she made her way to his bedside. She sat down and reached out to stroke his hair, whispering words the camera couldn't capture. But this time, our son didn't look frightened. He looked profoundly sad, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then she reached into her pocket. My breath caught in my throat. She withdrew a small white envelope, slightly crumpled, holding it as though it contained something precious and terrible in equal measure. My son immediately shook his head, a pleading gesture that made my stomach drop. My wife's face contorted with pain as she whispered something I couldn't hear, then carefully slid the envelope beneath his pillow. I leaned closer to the screen, my hands trembling so violently I could barely control the laptop. That's when I saw it. Written across the envelope in unfamiliar handwriting was a name. A man's name, not mine. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My wife's fingers trembled as she tucked the envelope away, her face streaked with silent tears. My son wiped at his own eyes and whispered something into her shoulder as she pulled him into a tight embrace. When she finally drew back, her lips formed words. I could read clearly, even without sound. He doesn't need to know yet. Understanding crashed over me like a physical blow. This envelope, this name, this man I'd never heard of. He was connected to my son in ways I'd never suspected. The implications cascaded through my mind, each one more devastating than the last. She wasn't finished. Reaching back into her pocket, she produced another envelope, this one older and yellowed with age, its edges worn from repeated handling. She placed it beside the first one, then took my son's hands in hers. Just forget these for now, I saw her mouth move. Please don't think about him tonight. The word reverberated through my skull. My vision blurred as tears I hadn't realized I was crying obscured the screen. I wanted to stop watching, to close the laptop and pretend I'd never seen any of it, but I couldn't look away. My wife held our son's hands and wept quietly, while his small fingers squeezed hers, as though trying to comfort her, to shoulder a burden far too heavy for a child. This wasn't fear or illness or stress. This was a secret she'd been carrying for years, hidden beneath the surface of our daily lives. A secret about my son's biological father, a man whose existence I'd never even imagined. And every night, she'd been sneaking into his room, not to hurt him or frighten him, but to manage this truth she'd kept buried. To protect him from a past that kept reaching forward, threatening to pull him back. I closed the laptop and sat in darkness, my entire body numb. The foundation of my life, everything I thought I knew about my family, had just revealed itself to be built on secrets I was never meant to discover. Sleep never came that night. I lay awake, watching the minutes crawl by, my mind churning through the footage again and again. By the time dawn broke, I'd made my decision. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't carry this knowledge alone, while she continued to hide it. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. I found her in the kitchen, moving through her morning routine as though everything was normal. For a moment, I simply watched her, wondering how many mornings she'd stood in this exact spot, holding this secret, presenting a carefully constructed version of herself, while the real truth festered beneath. I saw everything. The words came out barely above a whisper, but they might as well have been a shout for the effect they had. She froze mid-motion, the coffee mug slipping from her fingers and shattering against the tile floor. Neither of us moved to clean it up. She turned to face me slowly, her skin draining of color. Everything. Her voice cracked on the word, the letters, the name, all of it. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, and I watched as every defense she'd built crumbled in real time. Then she broke. Tears flooded down her cheeks as her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands clutching at the counter for support. I was trying to protect him, she sobbed. I didn't know how to explain it to you. I didn't know how to make you understand. My heart twisted painfully. Protect him from what? From me? No. She shook her head violently. From him, from the man who abandoned us before you ever came into our lives, who hurt me in ways I've never been able to forget. He keeps writing letters, keeps trying to insert himself back into our son's life, trying to pull him into chaos and pain. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him destroy what we've built. The words hit me like physical blows, each one reshaping my understanding of everything. This wasn't betrayal. This wasn't infidelity or deception for selfish reasons. This was a mother desperately trying to shield her child from a past that refused to stay buried. While simultaneously protecting a marriage she was terrified might not survive the truth. A sound from the doorway made us both turn. Our son stood there, still in his pajamas, his face pale and his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Mom, Dad, what's happening? His voice was small, fragile, already breaking. My wife reached for him instinctively, but he took a step back, uncertainty written across every feature. Were those letters about me? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. About my real father. The silence that followed felt infinite. 3 people standing in a kitchen, surrounded by the debris of a shattered secret, none of us knowing how to move forward. Our family, already strained to its breaking point, now balanced on the edge of a truth that could either destroy us or, somehow, set us free. My wife sank onto the couch, pulling our son close despite his initial resistance. She looked at me with eyes that held years of accumulated pain, fear, and guilt. Then, with a trembling breath, she began to speak. "Before I met your father," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears, "there was another man in my life. Your biological father. I was young and thought I understood what love was, but I was wrong. He hurt me, repeatedly and deeply, in ways I'm still healing from. When I found out I was pregnant, he left. Just vanished, as though we'd never mattered at all." She paused, struggling to maintain composure. Our son had gone very still, absorbing every word. The letters started arriving a few years ago. Apologies, excuses, requests to see you. Every time one came, I had to decide whether to let this man who abandoned us back into our lives, or to protect you from the possibility that he might hurt you the way he hurt me. I chose protection. Maybe that was wrong, but it was the only choice I felt I could make. Her fingers tightened around our son's hand. "I've lived with this guilt every single day. Guilt for hiding the truth from both of you. Guilt for making decisions that affected all of us without consultation. The fear became overwhelming. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every night I went to your room to check on you, to make sure you were safe, to reassure myself that I was doing the right thing, even when it felt completely wrong." She turned her gaze to me, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I should have trusted you with this from the beginning. I should have believed that our love was strong enough to handle the truth. But I was terrified that you'd look at him differently, that you'd love him less, knowing he wasn't biologically yours. Even though I knew rationally that wasn't how your love works. Fear makes you irrational. It makes you do things that hurt the people you're trying to protect." Our son's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "I felt it, Mom. Every night when you came to my room, I could feel how scared you were. I didn't understand why, but I knew you were trying to protect me from something." She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "This secret has been eating me alive. I thought carrying it alone would spare you both pain, but all it did was create distance and suspicion. I'm so sorry. To both of you." For a long moment, none of us spoke. The weight of years of secrecy hung in the air, but beneath it, something else was emerging. Understanding. The beginning of forgiveness. The pieces of the puzzle that had seemed so sinister and inexplicable were finally falling into place, revealing not betrayal but a desperate, misguided attempt to protect the people she loved most. I crossed the room and sat beside them, completing our small circle. "We'll figure this out," I said quietly. "Together." The days that followed were not easy. Healing never is. But gradually, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. The tension that had been suffocating us loosened its grip, replaced by something more honest, more real. My wife and I talked for hours, sometimes late into the night, laying bare fears and insecurities we'd both been hiding. I learned about her past in ways I never had before, understanding the scars she carried and why she'd been so determined to shield our son from similar pain. Our son asked questions, difficult ones, about the father he'd never known and the letters he'd never been allowed to read. We answered as honestly as we could, even when the truth was uncomfortable. He deserved that honesty. He deserved to be treated not as something fragile that needed protection from reality, but as a person capable of processing complex truths with our support. Some evenings, the three of us would sit together in the living room without any particular purpose, just being present with each other in a way we hadn't been in months. My wife would sometimes look at me with tears in her eyes, silently apologizing for secrets and lies. And I would take her hand because forgiveness had already quietly woven itself into the fabric of our healing. We weren't just rebuilding our family, we were building something stronger. Something based on truth rather than the carefully maintained illusions we'd both been clinging to. I came to understand something profound through this experience. Something I believe anyone who's ever loved someone needs to hear. We hide truths because we believe they'll shatter the people we care about. We convince ourselves that lies of omission are acts of kindness, that ignorance will protect those we love from pain. But silence doesn't preserve relationships. It erodes them slowly, invisibly, until one day you wake up and realize you're living with strangers wearing familiar faces. The truth does hurt sometimes. It can be sharp and unforgiving, and impossibly difficult to face. But lies hurt deeper, slower, and more permanently. They create distance where there should be intimacy, suspicion where there should be trust, fear where there should be safety. As I watched my family move forward, still imperfect and still healing, but fundamentally changed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. Not because our problems had magically disappeared, or because the past had been erased, but because we were finally living in truth. And in that truth, we found room to breathe, to heal, to choose love over fear every single day. We learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending the pain never existed. Forgiveness is choosing to move forward together despite the hurt. Choosing connection over resentment. Choosing to believe that people are more than their worst mistakes. It's the hardest and bravest choice a family can make. And as we took those first tentative steps into a future built on honesty, rather than secrets, I realized that sometimes the darkest moments in our lives aren't endings at all. Sometimes they're beginnings in disguise. Opportunities to tear down what was false and build something true in its place. Our family would never be the same as it was before. But perhaps, I thought as I held my wife's hand and watched our son smile genuinely for the first time in weeks, perhaps it would be something better.